Mountain Man found eggs near his cabin. When they hatched, he burst into tears. Out in the lonely Colorado highlands, a weathered mountain man stumbles upon a hidden nest. He carries the fragile eggs back to his cabin, never guessing what's about to happen. Days later, as tiny chicks crack through their shells, he breaks down weeping, his past grief crashing into this fragile new life. But just as hope returns, a starving boy steps from the shadows, claiming those eggs were meant to keep his sick mother alive. And the mountain man must choose, cling to his comfort, or risk everything to save strangers the town swears are enemies. As whispers spread, ranchers sharpen their knives. The preacher calls him a traitor, and flames threaten the very lives he swore to protect. From the ashes, a new miracle stirs. But not everyone wants peace to survive. Can one broken man's tears build a family stronger than hate? Or will mercy cost him everything he has left? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The morning sun crept over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-patched peaks in shades of rose and gold. Robert Carter's boots crunched through patches of crusty snow as he made his way along his trap line, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp spring air. The thaw was coming early this year, turning the ground soft and muddy in places where winter's grip had already loosened. His weathered hands worked quickly, checking each trap with the efficiency born of years of practice. The morning's take was modest, just 2 rabbit snares to reset and 1 empty trap to clean. Robert didn't mind. The quiet work gave him time to think, though sometimes thinking wasn't what he wanted most. A broken fence rail near his cabin caught his eye. The winter had been hard on his small homestead, and there was always something that needed mending. Robert gathered his tools and set to work, the familiar rhythm of hammering helping to chase away the morning chill. The old wood creaked as he secured the new rail in place, a sound almost lost under the raucous calls of magpies in the nearby brush. Those birds were making quite a fuss, more than usual for their morning chatter. Robert straightened up, his back protesting after being bent over the fence work. The magpies' excited calls drew his attention to a thick patch of scrub oak, about 20 paces away. Something had disturbed them, and in his experience, upset birds usually meant trouble of some kind. Moving quietly, Robert made his way toward the brush. As he drew closer, he caught sight of movement, the quick, darting form of a weasel slipping away through the undergrowth. His heart sank. Weasels were efficient killers, especially during nesting season. Pushing aside the twisted branches, Robert found what had drawn the predator's attention. There, carefully woven into the lower branches, sat a nest. 6 speckled eggs lay scattered around it, some still in the nest, but others knocked to the side. By some miracle, none appeared to be broken, though they felt cold to his touch when he carefully picked one up. Robert's hand trembled slightly as memories he'd tried to bury came rushing back. 10 years hadn't dulled the pain of that terrible night. The midwife's grim face, Sarah's final breath, and their stillborn child who never drew his first. He'd withdrawn into these mountains afterward, finding it easier to live among the wild things than to face the sympathetic looks of townspeople who didn't understand that their kind words only made the wound deeper. The egg felt so small in his calloused palm. Without the mother bird to warm them, these little lives would slip away just as surely as his own child had. Robert stood frozen for a long moment, torn between walking away from another possible heartache and doing what he knew Sarah would have done without hesitation. "Dadgum it all," he muttered, shrugging out of his wool coat. With careful movements, he lined one of the deep pockets with his spare bandana and, one by one, placed the eggs inside. He wrapped them gently, making sure they couldn't roll against each other on the journey home. The walk back to his cabin was slower than usual, each step measured to avoid jostling his precious cargo. Robert found himself automatically stepping around holes and rough spots he would normally have strode right over. The morning was warming up, but he knew the eggs needed more than just the heat from his body to survive. Inside his one-room cabin, Robert's mind raced through everything he knew about birds and their eggs. He'd watched enough nests over the years to understand the basics. They needed steady warmth and regular turning. His eyes fell on the hearth where a few coals still glowed from the morning's fire. Working quickly but carefully, Robert set several smooth river stones near the coals to warm. While they heated, he found an old wooden box that had once held rifle cartridges. He cleaned it thoroughly, then lined it with scraps of wool from an old blanket, creating a soft nest that would hold the heat from the stones. Once the stones were warm but not too hot, he tested them carefully against his wrist. He arranged them around the box, leaving enough space for the eggs in the center. Finally, with movements as gentle as if he were handling spun glass, Robert transferred the eggs from his coat pocket to their new home. "Reckon you'll need some light too," he murmured, positioning his old oil lamp near the box. Most birds he'd observed nested in places where at least some sunlight could reach their eggs. It seemed right to provide the same. His own stomach growling reminded him that he hadn't eaten since dawn. Robert put a pot of water on to boil and gathered some willow bark he'd collected last fall. The tea would help ease the ache in his back from all the bending and careful walking, though truth be told, he mostly wanted something warm to hold while he watched over his unexpected charges. As he waited for the water to boil, Robert found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse. "Lord, I ain't much asked for your help these past years. Reckon I was too angry, too hurt. But these little ones here, they ain't done nothing to deserve dying in the cold. If you've got any mercy to spare, might be they could use some." The rest of the day fell into a new rhythm. Every few hours, Robert carefully turned each egg, just a little, marking them with tiny pencil dots so he'd know which ones he'd turned. Between these sessions, he tried to go about his normal tasks but found himself constantly drawn back to check on the box. As evening approached, Robert sat in his old wooden chair by the hearth, his Bible open on his lap. The book had belonged to Sarah, and opening it still brought a familiar ache to his chest. But tonight, something compelled him to pick up the pencil again. On one of the blank pages in the back, he wrote in his rough hand, "Spring thaw, 1873. 6 foundlings by God's mercy. The good Lord gives second chances, even to old fools who forgot how to hope." The fire needed banking for the night, a task Robert had performed thousands of times. Tonight, though, he took extra care, making sure the coals would provide steady heat until morning. He checked the eggs one final time, adjusting the lamp so its light fell just right. Before lying down on his rope bed, Robert did one last thing. He strung his alarm line across the door, a trick he'd learned years ago. Any entrance would send the tin cups hanging from the string clattering, warning him of visitors, welcome or otherwise. Tonight, though, he found himself listening for much smaller sounds. Stretched out on his bed, Robert pulled his blanket up and stared at the ceiling, his ears straining for any hint of cracking or peeping from the box near the hearth. The familiar nighttime sounds of his cabin, the settling of logs, the soft pop of cooling coals, seemed somehow different now, as if the small space held its breath along with him, waiting for new life to stir. "Sleep warm, little ones," he whispered into the darkness, then, almost as an afterthought, "You too, Sarah. Reckon you'd be proud of this day's work." For the first time in years, the ache those words brought was accompanied by something else, a tiny, fragile spark of hope, as delicate and promising as the lives nestled in their woolen bed by the fire. The first hint of dawn hadn't yet touched the eastern sky when Robert woke. He'd slept fitfully, his ears attuned to any sound from the wooden box near the hearth. The cabin's interior held the deep chill that always preceded sunrise, and he knew his first task would be tending the fire and the precious eggs in his care. Moving quietly despite his stiff muscles, Robert struck a match and lit the oil lamp. Its warm glow revealed a thin layer of frost on the window pane. Winter wasn't quite ready to release its grip on the highlands. He added small sticks to the banked coals, watching as they caught and began to crackle. "Morning, little ones," he murmured, kneeling beside the makeshift incubator. The wooden box sat just where he'd left it, surrounded by the now cooled river stones. Robert placed his palm near the eggs, gauging their warmth with the sensitivity that came from years of wilderness survival. Too cool. They needed fresh, heated stones. He selected new rocks from his collection by the hearth, positioning them carefully around the coals. While they warmed, Robert consulted the rough chart he'd scratched on a piece of bark the night before, showing the turning schedule for each egg. He'd marked them with tiny dots of charcoal, making sure he could track their rotation. One by one, he lifted each speckled egg with gentle fingers that seemed too large for such delicate work. A quarter turn for each, slow and steady, then back into their wool nest. The morning light grew stronger as he worked, revealing the intricate patterns on each shell, no two exactly alike. "Reckon you need some fresh kindling," he said to the fire. The wood pile near the door was running low, and keeping the eggs warm would require more fuel than his usual needs. Robert pulled on his coat and boots, leaving the cabin door slightly ajar so he could hear any sounds from within. The axe bit into wood with practiced swings, but Robert found himself splitting smaller pieces than usual. Better to have fine control over the fire's temperature than risk it running too hot. He worked until he had a good-sized pile of kindling, then carried it inside in several trips, stacking it neatly by the hearth. A draft whistled under the cabin's north sill, making the lamp flame waver. Robert had been meaning to fix that gap for weeks, but now it took on new urgency. He couldn't risk the cold air affecting the egg's temperature. From his toolbox, he retrieved a handful of rags and his old caulking hammer. Working methodically, Robert tamped the cloth into the gap between log and sill. The draft quieted, then stopped altogether. He sat back on his heels, satisfied, then checked the warming stones. They'd reached the right temperature. Hot enough to warm the eggs, but not so hot they'd cook them. He switched out the cooled stones for fresh ones, arranging them carefully around the box. By mid-morning, his own stomach reminded him that he needed to fetch water, both for himself and to fill the pot he kept near the fire for humidity. The creek wasn't far, but leaving the eggs alone made him uneasy. Still, it had to be done. "I won't be gone long," he told the box, feeling foolish for talking to eggs but unable to help himself. "Just down to the creek and back." Outside, his mare Sadie nickered a greeting. Robert saddled her with care, taking time to check the cinch twice. The water barrels were lashed securely to either side of her broad back. Usually, he'd let her pick her own path down the rocky slope to the creek, but today he guided her with gentle pressure from his knees, choosing the smoothest route. "Easy now, girl," he murmured when she wanted to trot. "We're carrying precious cargo back up." The mare's ears flicked back at his voice, and she settled into a smooth walk that barely shifted the water in the barrels. The return trip took nearly an hour, though it usually took half that. Robert couldn't help but hurry inside as soon as he'd unsaddled Sadie, needing to check on his charges. The eggs sat undisturbed in their box, the temperature holding steady. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The afternoon stretched before him, hours to fill while maintaining his careful schedule of turning and warming. Robert retrieved his firearms from their rack, not for use, but for their regular maintenance. First came the Colt single action, a reliable companion that had served him well over the years. He field-stripped it with practiced ease, cleaning each part thoroughly. The Spencer carbine came next, though he rarely used it anymore. There had been a time, just after Sarah's death, when the rifle had seemed like his only friend. Now it served mostly as a reminder of darker days. Still, he cleaned it with the same attention he gave the Colt, oiling the action and checking the sights. "This here's going to be a peaceful place," he told the eggs as he worked. "No more hiding away from the world. No more letting grief do the thinking." The words surprised him as they came out, but he knew they were true. These small lives had awakened something in him, a desire to create safety, to nurture rather than just survive. The afternoon light was fading when a sound outside made him pause, his hand automatically reaching for the Colt. Light footsteps seemed to approach the cabin, then pass by. Robert held his breath, listening intently. After a moment, he recognized the sound, just meltwater running through the rocks carried by the warming day. He shook his head at his own jumpiness. As evening settled in, Robert lit the lamp again and reached for Sarah's Bible. It fell open naturally to the Psalms, the pages worn smooth by years of reading. His eyes found familiar words about refuge and shelter, about the God who watches over the smallest sparrow. The verses seemed to hold new meaning now. "Lord," he began softly, the prayer coming easier than it had the day before. "I don't rightly know what's going to hatch from these eggs. Could be anything from meadowlarks to magpies. But whatever you've sent my way, I aim to give them a fair chance at life." He paused, running his calloused hand over the worn pages. "And maybe give myself a fair chance too." The evening turning done, Robert placed his palm gently over the box one last time, checking the temperature. As he did so, something made him hold still. There, so faint he might have imagined it, came a tiny tremor from within one of the shells. His breath caught in his throat as he waited, wondering if he'd imagined it. But no, there it was again, the first stirring of life. Robert kept his hand there a moment longer, marveling at the fragile heartbeat he could barely feel. Then, moving carefully so as not to disturb the eggs, he added fresh, warm stones and adjusted the lamp. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but for now his charges were warm and safe, and that was enough. The first light of dawn had barely touched the cabin windows when Robert heard it, a soft tapping sound from the wooden box. He froze in the act of stoking the morning fire, his heart suddenly racing. Another tap followed, more distinct this time. Moving with deliberate care, Robert crossed to the box and knelt beside it. Yes, there it was, a tiny crack appearing in one of the speckled shells. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, forcing himself to stay still and just watch. "Easy now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the egg or himself. "Take your time." The crack widened, spreading like a thin lightning bolt across the shell's surface. A small, pointed beak appeared, pecking determinedly at the opening. Robert held his breath, his fingers itching to help, to reach out and peel away the shell. But he knew better. This was work the chick had to do on its own. For what seemed like hours, Robert watched the struggle. The beak would appear, chip away at the shell, then withdraw. Appear, chip, withdraw. His legs cramped from kneeling, but he didn't move. Finally, with a surprisingly strong push, the chick broke through. Wet feathers matted to its tiny body. It flopped onto the wool bedding, its dark eyes already alert and looking around. "Well, I'll be," Robert breathed, relief washing through him. Before he could fully process this miracle, movement from another egg caught his attention. A second shell was starting to crack. The morning passed in a blur of hatching. One by one, 4 chicks fought their way into the world. Robert watched each emergence with the same wonder as the first, his heart swelling with each success. They were ugly little things, truth be told, all wet feathers and oversized feet. But to him, they were beautiful. As the 4th chick cleared its shell and began to dry in the warm air, something broke inside Robert. Tears welled up suddenly, spilling down his weathered cheeks. He tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. 10 years of stored grief poured out of him. Grief for Sarah, for their stillborn child, for all the lonely years since. "Sarah," he choked out. "Oh, Sarah, you should see this." His shoulders shook with sobs that were somehow both sorrow and joy. "Our baby never had a chance to take a first breath, but these little ones." He gestured at the box through his tears. "They're fighting so hard to live." A weak peep from one of the chicks made him laugh wetly. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve and looked at the tiny creatures. "You must be hungry, aren't you? Well now, let's see what we can do about that." Still sniffling occasionally, Robert moved to the stove. He'd prepared for this, grinding some cornmeal extra fine the day before. He mixed it with a little warm water, stirring until it formed a thin mash. Testing the temperature carefully on his wrist like Sarah had once shown him to do with a baby's milk, he brought the mixture back to the box. "Your mama would know better than me how to feed you," he told the chicks, dipping his little finger in the mash and offering it to the nearest one. "But we'll figure it out together." To his relief, the chick pecked at his finger, getting more mash on its face than in its beak, but clearly interested. The others soon followed suit, their peeping growing stronger as they discovered food was available. "That's right," he encouraged them, talking aloud to the empty room. "Sarah, look at them eat. Remember how we talked about teaching our little one to use a spoon?" His voice caught, but the tears this time were gentler. "I reckon this is a mite different, but it feels right somehow." As the morning wore on, Robert settled into a routine of warming mash and feeding his charges. He barely noticed when the sun climbed toward noon, but a faint sound from outside caught his attention. Years of mountain living had taught him to notice every change in his surroundings. This wasn't the sound of melting snow or shifting rocks. These were footsteps, light and careful. Moving quietly, Robert approached the cabin door. He eased it open just enough to see out, scanning the tree line. There, among the pines, stood a boy. He was thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days, and Robert recognized him as Ute by his features and bearing. The boy stood absolutely still, watching the cabin with intense curiosity. Robert opened the door wider, moving slowly to show he meant no threat. He raised his empty hands in the gesture of peace he'd learned years ago during his trading days. "Hello there," he called softly in English. "It's all right, you're welcome here." For a moment their eyes met. Robert saw intelligence in that young face, and something else. Hunger, perhaps, or loneliness. But before he could say anything more, the boy melted away into the trees like a shadow at sunset. "Wait!" Robert called, but he knew it was useless. The boy was gone. Troubled by the encounter, Robert returned to his charges. The 4 hatchlings were sleeping now, their tiny bodies huddled together for warmth. The remaining 2 eggs sat unchanged, but when he checked them carefully, they still felt warm with life inside. "Don't give up on your sisters or brothers yet," he told the sleeping chicks. "Sometimes the strongest ones take the longest to decide they're ready." As evening approached, Robert found himself thinking about the boy. How long had he been watching? Was he alone? The thought of a child out there in the wilderness, perhaps hungry, wouldn't leave him be. Moving to his small pantry, Robert pulled out his precious store of cornmeal and the last of his bacon. He mixed up a batch of cornbread, adding the bacon grease to make it richer. While it baked, he fried up several strips of the bacon, more than he would normally allow himself. When darkness began to fall, Robert placed the cornbread and bacon on a tin plate and set it on the cabin's front stoop. "For any hungry traveler," he said loudly enough to carry into the trees, though he saw no movement there. Back inside, he checked on his charges one last time before banking the fire for the night. The 4 hatchlings slept soundly, their tiny sides rising and falling with each breath. The 2 unhatched eggs remained still but warm. Robert added fresh, heated stones around them, not ready to give up hope. Through the cabin's window, he caught a glimpse of movement near the front step, just as the moon began to rise. Robert smiled, but didn't move to look closer. Some gifts were better given without watching to see who received them. The first light of dawn crept through Robert's window, painting pale stripes across the cabin floor. He stirred from his rope bed, stretching muscles stiff from yesterday's vigil. The 4 newly hatched chicks peeped softly from their box, reminding him of his duties. After warming fresh stones and checking that the 2 unhatched eggs remained promising, Robert stepped outside to fetch more firewood. The crisp mountain air bit at his face as he paused on the stoop, his eyes drawn to the empty plate he'd left out the night before. Not just empty, cleaned spotlessly as if someone had run a finger across its surface to catch every crumb. Robert's heart tightened at the thought of such desperate hunger. Kneeling down, he examined the ground near the step. There, pressed into the soft earth where snow had recently melted, was a single clear track. A child's moccasin. The print was fresh, probably from first light. Robert studied the direction it pointed, toward a dense stand of spruce trees. Without hesitation, he left his coat unbuttoned and empty of weapons. Whoever was out there had already shown trust by coming to his door. He would honor that trust in return. Moving with the quiet skill of his trapping years, Robert followed the trail. It wasn't hard. Hunger had made the boy less careful than before. Broken twigs and disturbed leaves showed his passage clearly to experienced eyes. Near a massive spruce, Robert found him. The Ute boy lay curled on his side, using a bed of fallen needles for what little warmth they offered. His clothes, though carefully mended, hung loose on his thin frame. Even in sleep, his face showed the strain of too many meals missed. Robert cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle the child. The boy's eyes snapped open, his body tensing to flee. "Easy now," Robert said, keeping his voice gentle. He stayed where he was, hands open at his sides. "No need to run. I'm glad you enjoyed the cornbread." The boy sat up slowly, watching Robert with wary eyes. After a long moment, he spoke in careful, practiced English. "It was good bread. Thank you." "You're welcome." Robert smiled, encouraged by the response. "I'm Robert Carter. Most folks just call me Robert." The boy seemed to weigh his options before responding. "Daniel," he said finally. "My name is Daniel." "Well met, Daniel." Robert noticed the boy's slight shivering. "Have you been watching my cabin long?" Daniel nodded. "I saw the eggs." A flash of animation crossed his face. "They hatched?" "4 of them did," Robert confirmed. 2 more still waiting. "Would you like to see them?" Hope and hesitation warred on Daniel's face. His stomach answered for him. growling audibly in the morning quiet. Color rose in his cheeks, but Robert pretended not to notice. "I've got jerky and fresh water in the cabin," he said casually, "and it's warmer by the hearth. The chicks would welcome another set of eyes watching over them." Daniel's resolve wavered. "The eggs, I wanted to help when the weasel came, but you found them first." "Then you've got as much right to see them as I do," Robert said firmly. He extended his hand. "Come on, son. Let's get some food in you." The boy accepted his help standing, but swayed slightly once upright. Robert steadied him, concerned by how little weight there was to his frame. They walked slowly back to the cabin, Robert shortening his stride to match Daniel's tired steps. Inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around them like a blessing. Daniel's eyes went immediately to the box where the chicks peeped and scratched. Robert pulled out his chair, gesturing for the boy to sit while he fetched food and water. "4 healthy ones," Robert explained, setting a cup of water and strips of jerky before Daniel. "Strong little fighters, every one of them." He watched as Daniel tried to eat slowly, fighting the urge to bolt the food. "Take your time. There's plenty more." Between careful bites, Daniel's attention kept returning to the box. Robert brought it closer, letting him see the tiny birds. The boy's face softened as he watched them, and something in Robert's chest ached at the sight. How long had it been since this child had known simple joys? "My mother," Daniel said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She burns inside. Many days now." His eyes met Robert's, fear breaking through his careful reserve. "The fever does not leave her." Robert felt the weight of those words settle in his gut. "Your people, they're nearby?" Daniel nodded. "In the ravine, where the creek bends. The town." He trailed off, but Robert could fill in the rest. He'd seen how some towns treated native families seeking help. Robert stood, decision made. "I know something about fevers. I've got medicines that might help. Willow bark, yarrow." He started gathering supplies, wrapping herbs and clean cloth in a blanket. "Will you show me the way to your mother?" Relief and gratitude flooded Daniel's face. "You will help?" "Yes." Robert's voice was firm. No one should suffer alone when help is possible. He thought of Sarah, of all the times she'd tended sick neighbors despite the risk. The memory strengthened his resolve. Moving efficiently, Robert prepared for the journey. He wrapped a warm blanket around Daniel's shoulders, then led the boy outside where he quickly saddled Sadie. The mare stood patient and steady as Robert helped Daniel mount. "I'll lead her," Robert explained, gathering the reins. "You just focus on staying in the saddle. We'll take it slow and easy. No need to jostle you more than necessary." They set out under the late morning sun, Robert keeping to the smoothest path he could find. Daniel sat quiet, but alert in the saddle, pointing the way with small gestures when needed. They passed through stands of aspen and pine, working gradually down toward the creek valley. Robert kept one eye on his young companion, noting how the boy's shoulders gradually relaxed as they traveled. Trust, he knew, was earned in small moments like these. When they stopped briefly to let Sadie drink, he shared his canteen and more jerky with Daniel, pleased to see some color returning to the boy's face. The sun was sliding toward late afternoon when Daniel straightened in the saddle, pointing to a narrow path that wound down into a ravine. The sound of running water drifted up from below, along with the faint scent of wood smoke. "There," Daniel said softly. "My mother." He raised his voice, calling out words in Ute that Robert didn't understand but recognized as a peaceful announcement of approach. The words echoed off the ravine walls, carrying ahead to warn of their coming. Robert adjusted his grip on Sadie's reins, squaring his shoulders. He didn't know what welcome awaited them below, but looking up at Daniel's worried face, he knew he'd made the right choice. Some risks were worth taking, especially when a child's trust and a mother's life hung in the balance. The ravine lay in deep shadow, sheltered by towering pines and weathered rock walls. A small stream whispered nearby, its voice mixing with the soft rustling of leaves overhead. Robert followed Daniel down the narrow path, leading Sadie carefully between the rocks. 2 hide-wrapped shelters nestled against the ravine wall, with a small cook fire smoking between them. An older woman emerged from the nearest shelter, her face lined with worry. She spoke rapidly to Daniel in Ute, her eyes never leaving Robert. Daniel responded quietly, gesturing toward Robert and then the bundle of medicines. The woman, Daniel's aunt, Robert gathered from the boy's tone, nodded slowly, but remained watchful as they approached. "My mother," Daniel said in English, sliding carefully from Sadie's back. He led Robert to the second shelter, pulling back the hide flap. Inside, a woman lay beneath a worn quilt, her face shining with fever sweat. Even ill, she carried herself with dignity, her long black hair neatly braided despite her weakness. Her eyes, bright with fever, fixed on Robert as he knelt beside her. "I'm Robert Carter," he said softly. "Daniel brought me to help, if you'll allow it." He waited, showing his empty palms in the gesture of peace. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I am Taya." Her English was clear despite her weakness. "My son says you tend birds' eggs with great care." Robert smiled gently. "Yes, ma'am, and I know something of fevers too. May I?" He gestured toward her wrist, asking permission to check her pulse. Taya nodded, extending her arm. Her pulse raced under his fingers, too fast and thready. Her skin burned with the fever Daniel had described. "I brought willow bark for the fever," Robert explained, opening his bundle, "and yarrow to help you sweat it out proper." He laid out his supplies, clean cloth, herbs, and a small pot for brewing tea. Daniel's aunt, who introduced herself as Minnie, helped him build up the cook fire. Robert measured the yarrow carefully, explaining each step to Daniel, who watched intently. While the tea steeped, he soaked a cloth in cool stream water and gently bathed Taya's forehead. "Small sips," he instructed when the tea was ready, helping Taya sit up slightly. "Too much at once will upset your stomach." She complied, grimacing at the bitter taste but drinking steadily. Robert nodded approvingly and turned to his saddlebags, pulling out a small pot of beef broth he'd packed. "The body needs strength to fight fever," he said, setting the broth to warm. "This will help if you can manage it." As he tended Taya, Robert learned more about their situation. The small band had been traveling toward their summer grounds when Taya fell ill. They kept to the back country, avoiding the main trails where ranchers had grown hostile over grazing rights. "The clerk at White River Agency," Daniel explained, his young face troubled. "He says we need papers now. Special passes to enter town." "Even for medicine?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. Taya shook her head weakly. "He does not see us. We wait at his door, but he is always too busy when we come." Robert's jaw tightened at the familiar story. He'd seen such treatment before. Good people turned away by those who held small powers and wielded them cruelly. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said, measuring out another dose of willow bark tea. "The general store carries quinine, and you'll need flour and other supplies to rebuild your strength." "The store owner," Minnie warned, "he will not sell to us. He'll sell to me," Robert said firmly. "I've traded there for years." Taya touched his arm lightly. "You risk much helping strangers." Robert thought of the magpie eggs, of Daniel's careful watching, of how Providence sometimes worked through unexpected meetings. "We're not strangers now," he said simply. Before leaving, he left a pouch of cornmeal and a carefully written note. "In case I'm delayed in town," he explained. "Daniel can read it to you. He's quite good with English letters." The boy straightened proudly at this praise, then grew serious. "You will return?" "You have my word," Robert assured him. "Keep your mother drinking the tea, a little at a time. Cool cloths when the fever rises. I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies." The ride home was slow, the afternoon light fading toward evening. Robert stopped once to check Sadie's cinch, which had loosened on the rocky trail. While readjusting the leather straps, he thought about the tiny chicks waiting in his cabin. Like Taya, they needed regular care to survive. When he finally reached home, the cabin was quiet except for the soft peeping from the box by the hearth. Robert checked each chick carefully, all 4 still healthy and active. The 2 unhatched eggs remained warm, though silent. He prepared fresh mash for the hatchlings, watching as they pecked eagerly at the food. At his desk, Robert lit the lamp and began writing his supply list. Quinine, flour, sugar, coffee, dried beef, more cornmeal. He added bandages and soap, knowing Taya would need them during her recovery. The list grew longer than his usual modest requirements. Robert opened his money belt, counting the coins and notes carefully. He had enough saved, barely, But buying supplies for others would draw attention in a town where everyone knew his solitary habits. Questions would follow. Suspicions, too. Still, watching the chicks settle into their wool nest for the night, Robert felt a certainty about his course. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now, he had promises to keep, and lives depending on his return. He added the last items to his list, then secured his money belt around his waist. First light would find him on the trail to town, ready to face whatever waited there. The lamp flickered as he banked the fire for the night. 4 tiny birds peeped softly in their box, while far below in a shadowed ravine, a mother and son waited for his return. Robert touched the money belt, feeling the weight of coins that could buy medicine and food, or buy trouble, depending on how tomorrow unfolded. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight he had chicks to tend and prayers to whisper, and the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning sun cast long shadows as Robert guided Sadie down the winding trail toward Mineral Ridge. The town sprawled in the valley below, a cluster of wooden buildings and rutted streets that marked civilization's unsteady reach into the wilderness. Chimney smoke rose straight in the still air, and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed off the surrounding hills. Robert had chosen his timing carefully, mid-morning when the store would be less crowded. He'd washed his face and combed his beard, wanting to draw as little attention as possible. His worn canvas coat was clean, if patched, and his money belt rode hidden beneath it. The ride took nearly 6 hours at an easy pace. Robert kept Sadie to a steady walk, mindful of the rocky trail and the return journey ahead. He used the time to rehearse his requests, planning how to keep his tone casual when asking for supplies that would clearly serve more than one man. As they descended into town, the spring mud had dried enough to let wagon wheels roll freely. Robert guided Sadie past the livery stable, the newspaper office, and the newly painted church before reining in at the general store. He looped Sadie's reins around the hitching rail, giving her an affectionate pat before climbing the wooden steps to the store's broad porch. The bell above the door jangled as he entered. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and tobacco wrapped around him. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from farm tools to patent medicines. Mr. Grove, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger and nodded a greeting. "Mornin', Robert. Early for your monthly supplies, ain't you?" "Need a few extra things," Robert replied, keeping his voice even. He pulled his list from his pocket and began methodically working his way through it. 2 sacks of flour, he started, watching Grove's eyebrows rise slightly. "And I hear tell you might have some quinine powder?" Grove scratched his chin. "Might have a bit. Supply's been tight since that fever went through Eagle Creek. Ain't cheap." "I'll take what you can spare," Robert said. He added salt pork to his growing pile, then lamp oil and other necessities. Each item he selected with care, knowing exactly how it would be used. The flour for bread to build strength, the quinine to break the fever, the lamp oil to see through the long nights of illness. The store's bell chimed again. Brother Rollins stepped inside, his black coat dusty from riding circuit between the scattered ranches. His weathered face broke into a smile when he spotted Robert. "Brother Carter, a joy to see you in town." The preacher approached with hand extended. "We've missed you at services." Robert shook the offered hand politely. "Been keeping to myself as usual." Rollins's keen eyes swept over the growing pile of supplies on Grove's counter. His smile faded slightly when he noted the second sack of flour. "That's quite a stock you're laying in," he observed. "Expecting company up your way?" Robert met his gaze steadily. "Just being prepared." Rollins stroked his gray beard. "I trust you're being discerning in your preparations. We've had reports of certain elements moving through the area. Vagrants, you might say. Those who'd take advantage of Christian charity." He pulled a small Bible from his coat pocket. As Scripture tells us in 2 Thessalonians, "If any would not work, neither should he eat." Robert carefully measured his response, remembering Daniel's mother burning with fever, the boy's thin face as he watched the eggs. "Scripture also tells us Christ fed the 5,000, he said quietly, without asking to see their papers first. A flush crept up Rollins's neck. "Now see here, Robert." The bell chimed again, interrupting whatever sermon was brewing. Miss Emma Fitch, the town's schoolteacher, stepped inside. She was a slight woman in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a quiet way about her that commanded respect from even the rowdiest students. "Good morning, Brother Rollins," she said pleasantly. Mr. Carter. She moved past them to examine the shelf of patent medicines, but Robert noticed her head tilted slightly toward their conversation. Rollins lowered his voice. I'm simply saying we must be cautious. These people have their own agency to look after them. It's not our place to interfere with official arrangements. Good day, brother, Robert said firmly, turning back to Grove. I'll take that quinine now, if you please. The preacher lingered a moment longer, then departed with a disappointed shake of his head. The bell announced his exit. Grove measured out the precious quinine powder, wrapping it carefully in waxed paper. That'll be $8.45 total, he said, tallying the bill. Robert counted out the money, trying not to wince at the cost. As he gathered his purchases, Miss Emma approached the counter. Mr. Carter, she said softly. A moment, please. She pressed 2 items into his hands, a tin of horehound candy and a slim blue primer book. Before he could protest, she spoke in a near whisper. The candy helps with coughing, and the book, well, everyone deserves a chance to learn. Her eyes met his with quiet understanding. God's mercy knows no boundaries, after all. Robert's throat tightened. Much obliged, Miss Fitch. She gave him a slight nod and left the store, her skirt swishing softly against the wooden floor. Robert secured his purchases in Sadie's saddlebags, then led her down the muddy street to the telegraph office. The operator, young Ted Wilson, sat at his desk, the brass key clicking steadily under his fingers. Need to send a wire, Robert said, pulling out paper and pencil, to Mr. Hartley at the White River Agency. He composed his message carefully, asking about medical allowances and proper procedures. Ted counted the words, named his price, and set to work sending it westward along the singing wires. Might get a reply by evening, Ted said, if Hartley's at his desk and not out on rounds. I'll check back before heading home, Robert replied, though he knew the chance of a same-day response was slim. The sun had begun its westward slide by the time he turned Sadie toward home. He kept her to a steady walk, despite his urgency to return. The supplies in his saddlebags were too precious to risk with haste. Shadows lengthened across the trail. Robert thought of Daniel and his mother waiting in their hidden camp. He thought of Brother Rawlins's warnings and Miss Emma's quiet defiance. Mostly, he thought about how helping others was rarely simple, but always necessary. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the mountain peaks. Robert's first action was to check the box by the hearth, where 4 healthy chicks peeped a welcome. The 2 remaining eggs showed delicate cracks spreading like spiderwebs across their shells, life preparing to emerge. He quickly stored the supplies, filled his pack with what was needed in the ravine, and lit his lantern. The twilight was deepening toward true dark as he set out on foot, the lantern swinging gently with each step. Behind him, the cabin's warmth held his tiny charges safe, while ahead, through the gathering night, others waited for his return. The lantern's glow made a small circle of light around him as he walked, each step guided by faith and necessity. Above, the first stars began to appear, bright and steady in the darkening sky. Night had settled fully over the Colorado highlands when Robert reached the ravine. Stars pierced the darkness overhead, and a quarter moon cast thin shadows through the pines. He paused at the edge of the camp, set his lantern carefully on a flat rock, and called out in a clear, measured voice, "Daniel, it's Robert Carter." Quiet rustling followed, then Daniel's aunt appeared like a shadow among shadows. She gestured him forward with dignified grace. Robert retrieved his lantern and followed her to the lean-to where Taya lay beneath the worn quilt. Daniel sat cross-legged beside his mother, his young face drawn with worry. The boy managed a wan smile when Robert knelt nearby and began unpacking his supplies. "Brought medicine," Robert said softly, showing the wrapped quinine powder, and some other things that might help. He pulled out the tin of horehound candy Miss Emma had given him, along with fresh cloth for compresses and the supplies from the store. Daniel's eyes widened at the sight of the flour sack. Robert worked methodically in the lantern light, measuring the bitter quinine powder carefully before mixing it with hot water from the kettle that hung over their small fire. The medicine's sharp scent filled the close air of the shelter. "Daniel," he said, "help me lift your mother's head a bit. She needs to drink this even though it tastes mighty unpleasant." The boy supported Taya's shoulders while Robert held the cup to her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever, but she sipped obediently. When she'd taken enough, Robert laid a fresh, cool compress across her forehead. The long hours until dawn passed slowly. Robert dozed occasionally against a tree trunk, but mostly he kept watch, replacing compresses and coaxing more quinine tea into Taya when needed. Daniel refused to sleep, instead helping tend his mother with quiet determination. The sky was just beginning to pale when Taya's fever finally broke. Sweat beaded on her face, and her breathing grew deeper, more regular. Robert touched her wrist. Her pulse was stronger, steadier. He let out a long breath of relief. "Your mother's doing better," he told Daniel, who had been watching anxiously. "The fever's breaking. Now we need to keep her comfortable and clean." As morning light filtered through the trees, Robert showed Daniel how to fold clean cloth into neat compresses. The boy's small hands were clumsy at first, but he concentrated fiercely on getting the folds just right. "Like this?" Daniel asked, holding up his handiwork. "That's fine work," Robert approved, "and you're a quick study." After ensuring Taya was resting comfortably, Robert noticed one of the shelter's support poles was warped, causing the canvas to sag. He retrieved his tool roll from his pack and pulled out a small plane. "Come here," he called to Daniel. "I'll show you how to true up this pole proper." Daniel watched intently as Robert demonstrated how to check the wood straightness and make smooth, even strokes with the plane. Curls of pine wood fell at their feet as the pole gradually straightened under their efforts. "Your turn," Robert said, handing the plane to Daniel. "Nice and steady, just like I showed you." The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he worked. His first few strokes were hesitant, but he soon found the rhythm. "Thank you," Daniel said carefully, practicing the English words. "Thank you for helping my mother." Robert's throat tightened at the simple sincerity in the boy's voice. "You're welcome," he replied softly. Daniel set down the plane and looked up at Robert with solemn eyes. "I will give you something too." He began to sing quietly, a gentle melody in his native Ute. The words were strange to Robert's ears, but the reverent tone needed no translation. When the brief song ended, Daniel explained, "It is a prayer for good medicine, for healing." Robert bowed his head slightly, honored by the gift. "That's mighty fine singing, Daniel. Thank you for sharing it with me." The sun had climbed past its zenith when Robert checked his pocket watch. "I need to head back to feed those chicks," he said. "They get mighty vocal when their meal's late. I'll return tomorrow with more supplies." Daniel nodded, already turning back to where his mother slept peacefully. Robert gathered his tools and empty canteen, relief lightening his steps as he made his way home through the warming day. After tending to the hungry chicks, Robert rode Sadie into town. The telegraph office was his first stop. Young Ted Wilson looked up from his key with a grin. "Came in late yesterday," he said, pulling a yellow paper from his desk. "Held it for you, figuring you'd be back." Robert unfolded the telegram and read Hartley's precise response. "Medical rations authorized. Stop adult must appear in person. Stop formal signature required at agency. Stop regards Hartley." It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a legal way to get Taya and Daniel the help they needed. The agency was a 2-day ride west, but with a slow wagon for Taya to rest in, they could make it safely once she was stronger. The afternoon was wearing on by the time Robert finished his errands in town. Shadows stretched long across the rutted street as he guided Sadie homeward. The mare's steady hoofbeats marked time with his planning. 2 more days for Taya to regain strength and the careful journey to the agency. They would need blankets for the wagon, extra water, soft food for the trail. Full darkness had fallen by the time he reached his cabin. Too late to visit the ravine again tonight, though he wished he could check on Taya's progress. The chicks peeped demandingly from their box by the hearth as he lit the lamp. After feeding his tiny charges, Robert settled into his chair and pulled out the primer book Miss Emma had given him. He opened to the first page, where simple words marched across the paper in neat rows. His finger traced beneath each word as he read aloud to his attentive audience of chicks. "See the dog runs, run dog run." The familiar childhood phrases brought a smile to his weathered face as he imagined teaching them to Daniel. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in the lamp's warm glow, hope felt as solid and real as the book in his hands. The rising sun painted the mountain peaks gold as Robert moved through his morning routine. The chicks were growing stronger each day, their downy feathers filling in as they wobbled around their box near the hearth. He scattered fresh feed for them before heading out to check on Taya and Daniel. Over the past 2 days, a rhythm had settled into place. Each morning he'd ride to the ravine with fresh broth and supplies, staying through the warmest hours to help where needed. Yesterday, he'd shown Daniel how to split kindling safely, guiding the boy's small hands on the axe handle. Keep your feet apart, he'd instructed, demonstrating the stance, and always look where the blade will fall. Daniel had proven an eager student, his face bright with concentration as he practiced the careful movements. Taya had watched from her blankets, color slowly returning to her cheeks as strength flowed back into her limbs. Now on the third morning, Robert hitched his old wagon before dawn. He'd spent the evening prior checking every bolt and wheel, knowing they'd need to move slow and steady. The wagon bed was lined with fresh straw and his warmest quilts, creating a nest where Taya could rest during the long journey to the agency. The sun had just cleared the trees when they set out. Taya lay cushioned among the quilts, while Daniel perched on the wagon seat beside Robert. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in everything as they followed the rutted trail westward. "Might see some deer," Robert said, pointing to fresh tracks in the mud. "They like to drink at the creek we'll be crossing." Daniel nodded eagerly. "I saw 3 yesterday near our camp. One had spots still." Robert clicked softly to the horses, keeping them at a careful walk. No sense rushing and jarring the wagon over every bump. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. Behind them, the mountains rose blue against the brightening sky. Near mid-morning, they reached the creek crossing. Robert halted the wagon and walked ahead to check the ford. Spring melt had raised the water, but rocks still showed above the surface, marking the safe path. He returned to guide the horses through, speaking calm encouragement as they picked their way across. "Steady now," he murmured. "Nice and easy." The wagon wheels bumped over submerged stones, water splashing up to wet the spokes. Daniel gripped the seat tight, but his eyes shone with excitement. Behind them, Taya had raised herself on one elbow to watch their progress. They stopped for rest at noon in a small meadow. Robert helped Taya sit up against the wagon wheel while he built a small fire to heat coffee. Daniel explored nearby, staying within sight, as Robert had asked. The peaceful moment was broken by hoofbeats approaching. Robert straightened, recognizing Sheriff Leland's bay mare before the man himself came into view. "Morning, Robert," the sheriff called, reining in nearby. His eyes took in the wagon, its occupants, and their direction of travel. "Headed somewhere particular?" "Sheriff," Robert nodded respectfully. "We're bound for the White River Agency. Got authorization from Clerk Hartley for medical rations." Leland dismounted, his expression grave. "Might want to keep alert. Some of Henderson's ranch hands been grumbling about Indians crossing their claimed grazing land. Nothing official yet, but they're stirring up trouble." "We're traveling legal," Robert said firmly, "following the rules, getting proper passes. These are good people, Sheriff." Leland's weathered face softened slightly as he glanced at Daniel, who had edged closer to the wagon. "I know that, Robert. Just giving fair warning. Some folks don't care much for rules when their minds are set." "Much obliged for the word," Robert replied. "We'll keep our eyes open." The sheriff mounted up, touching his hat brim to Taya. "Safe journey to you all." They reached White River Agency as afternoon shadows lengthened across the dusty yard. The flag hung limp above the whitewashed building, and a few clerks moved between the office and the storehouse. Robert helped Taya down from the wagon, supporting her as they made their way to the office door. Mr. Hartley sat behind his desk, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he examined their papers. "Authorization requires personal signature," he stated, pushing a form toward Taya. "Your mark here, if you please." Taya's hand was steady as she signed. Hartley nodded, adding his own signature below. "Now then," he continued, "regarding passes for town access, you'll need to request these specifically. Minimum 3 days advance notice. Grazing rights are restricted to designated areas only, marked on this map." He spread a crease survey map across the desk. "The Henderson Ranch holds most water rights west of the creek. Best keep clear of there." Robert listened carefully, noting each requirement. Rules might be frustrating, but they offered protection too. Legal right to be present, to travel, to receive help. Hartley finished his explanation and wrote out an order for the storehouse. Basic rations, flour, beans, salt pork, and here, he penned a separate note, for Reverend Rollins. The church maintains a charity fund for medical necessities. The sun was setting by the time they made camp outside the agency fence. Robert got a fire going while Daniel helped him set up a simple shelter. The boy had learned quickly how to drive tent pegs and stretch canvas tight. Taya sat wrapped in quilts watching the beans simmer in their pot. The familiar smell of cooking food filled the growing darkness. Stars began to prick through the deep blue sky above them. "We'll head back at first light," Robert said, stirring the beans. "Take it slow and easy, same as coming. Should make home by sunset tomorrow if weather holds." Daniel nodded sleepily, leaning against his mother's shoulder. Taya's hand stroked his dark hair, her face peaceful in the firelight. Robert served up 3 bowls of beans, then settled back against his saddle to eat. The night was quiet except for the pop of burning wood and the distant cry of a coyote. They had walked the narrow path of law today, pushed for what mercy the rules allowed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. A way forward that might, with patience and persistence, lead to something better. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in the warm circle of firelight, they could rest. Robert watched the flames dance and felt a deep sense of rightness settle in his chest. Sometimes the hardest road was also the truest. The sun rose golden over the eastern peaks, painting the agency yard in warm light. Robert had risen before dawn to check the horses and prepare for the journey home. Now he helped Taya settle into the wagon bed, while Daniel climbed up to his spot on the seat. "Ready?" Robert asked, glancing back at his passengers. Taya nodded, adjusting the quilts around her shoulders. Her fever had broken days ago, but the morning air still held a bite of winter's chill. They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, moving at an unhurried pace. Robert kept the horses to a steady walk, mindful of every bump and rut in the trail. Behind them, the agency buildings grew smaller until they disappeared around a bend. Daniel pointed out wildlife as they traveled. A red-tailed hawk circling overhead, a family of deer picking their way through scrub oak, the tracks of a raccoon that had crossed the trail sometime in the night. Robert smiled at the boy's keen eyes, remembering his own childhood fascination with the creatures of the wild. "Look there," Robert said softly, indicating movement in a patch of wild grass. "Cottontail. Probably has little ones in a burrow nearby." The morning warmed as they traveled, the spring sun gaining strength. Near mid-morning, Robert drew the wagon to a halt in a small clearing beside the trail. The horses needed rest, and he wanted Taya to take some broth while it was still warm in the jar. "We'll stop here a spell," he announced, helping Taya sit up against the wagon wheel. He retrieved the jar of broth from its nest of warm cloths and poured a portion into a tin cup. Daniel stretched his legs, walking the perimeter of the clearing while keeping within sight. Robert watched the boy examine interesting rocks and leaves, his natural curiosity a bright thing in the morning light. Taya sipped the broth carefully, color rising in her cheeks. "The medicine man at the agency says I am healing well," she said. "Soon I will have strength to work again." Robert nodded, pleased to see her improvement. "No need to rush," he said. "Better to heal proper than quick." They rested for nearly an hour before continuing on. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air and bringing out the scent of pine and new growth. Robert kept them to the main trail, avoiding the contested grazing lands the sheriff had warned about. By late afternoon, the familiar shape of Robert's cabin came into view through the trees. The sight of home lifted something in his chest, not just for himself this time, but for his passengers too. He'd come to care about their welfare more than he'd expected. "Almost there," he called back to Taya. She had dozed for the last hour, rocked by the wagon's gentle motion. Robert drew the wagon to a halt near his cabin door. The chickens he'd raised from eggs scattered at their approach, then regrouped to peck hopefully at the ground near the wheels. 2 newly hatched chicks tottered after their older siblings, still awkward on their feet. "Welcome to my home," Robert said formally, helping Taya down from the wagon. "Would you do me the honor of sharing supper, to celebrate safe travel and your returning health?" Taya inclined her head gracefully. "We would be honored," she replied in careful English. Robert set about making the cabin ready while Daniel helped unhitch the horses. He brought out his best tin plates, rarely used since his wife's passing, and set them on the worn table. He added his cleanest cups, a jar of wild honey, and his mother's old oil lamp for good measure. The lamp cast a warm glow as evening approached. Robert prepared a simple but filling meal, beans with salt pork, cornbread, and the last of his dried apples. The familiar scents filled the cabin, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. When all was ready, they gathered around the table. Robert cleared his throat softly. If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. At Taya's nod, he bowed his head. Lord, we thank you for safe travel for healing and for this food. Bless this meal and those who share it. Amen. The words were simple but heartfelt, the first prayer he'd spoken aloud and longer than he could remember. He looked to Daniel and gestured welcomingly. Would you like to offer words in your way? Daniel straightened proudly and spoke in Ute, his young voice carrying the rhythms of his people's prayers. The two newest chicks chose that moment to toddle between their boots, drawing laughter from all three of them. They were halfway through the meal when a knock sounded at the door. Robert opened it to find Emma Fitch standing there with a covered basket. I hope I'm not intruding, she said warmly. I saw the wagon return and thought you might enjoy some fresh bread. She smiled at Taya and Daniel. And I brought something else as well. From her basket, she produced a shirt, one of Daniel's now neatly mended. The boy's face lit up as he recognized it, running his fingers over the careful stitching. Thank you, he said clearly in English, then added words in Ute that made his mother smile. Emma settled at the table with them, breaking bread and sharing stories. After they'd eaten, she drew a small Bible from her basket and found a particular page. I'd like to read something if I may, she said. At their nods, she began reading the parable of the Good Samaritan, her clear voice bringing the ancient words to life. When she finished, she closed the book gently. I'll speak with Brother Rollins, she promised. He's a good man at heart, just set in his ways. Sometimes it takes time for people to remember that mercy knows no boundaries. The evening deepened around them. Emma took her leave with warm goodbyes, promising to return with more books for Daniel's reading lessons. The boy had moved to sit by the hearth, drowsy with good food and the day's travel. Taya's voice rose soft and clear in the lamplight, a lullaby in her native tongue. The melody wound through the cabin like smoke, ancient and soothing. Daniel's eyes drifted closed as he leaned against the warm stones. Robert stood quietly by the stove, taking in the scene before him. The lamplight caught the silver in Taya's dark hair, illuminated Daniel's peaceful face, gleamed off the tin plates that had held their shared meal. The two newest chicks had settled into their box, peeping softly in their sleep. As he banked the stove for the night, Robert found himself speaking aloud. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for this. The words came easier than he'd expected, rising from a place in his heart he'd thought long closed. For the first time in years, his cabin felt truly like a home, warm with lamplight and living voices, blessed with the peace of shared meals and dual-language prayers. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment was a gift he would treasure. Gray light seeped through the window as Robert stirred the breakfast fire. The chicks peeped softly in their box, eager for their morning meal. He had just measured out feed when heavy bootsteps thundered across his front porch. The door rattled with 3 sharp knocks. Robert opened it to find 4 men crowding his doorstep. He recognized Decker, the Circle Bar ranch foreman, standing front and center with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. The polished single-action Colt rode low on his hip. Behind him stood 3 ranch hands, their faces hard in the dim morning light. Carter, Decker said, his voice carrying the bite of early frost, we need to talk about your Indian friends. Robert's jaw tightened. He kept his voice level. What about them? They're stealing grass from Circle Bar land, running their ponies on our range. Decker took a step forward, boots scraping on the wooden boards. You need to send them packing. They're camping on open land, Robert said, following the agency rules about grazing. Nothing illegal about it. One of the hands spat over the rail. Since when do you speak for Indians, Carter? Since they needed speaking for, Robert answered quietly. He shifted his weight, careful to keep his hands visible and steady. Through the open door, he could see Taya and Daniel stirring from their pallets near the hearth. Decker's face darkened. Don't get smart with us, those savages need to clear out before there's trouble. The only trouble I see is standing on my porch, Robert said. They've got as much right to be here as anyone. The blow came fast, Decker's fist catching Robert across the temple. He staggered, vision blurring, as the men shoved past him into the cabin. His head cracked against the doorframe as he fell. No! Taya's voice cut through the chaos. She grabbed Daniel, pulling him behind her as the ranch hands stomped through the small space. One man kicked over a chair. Another knocked the brooder box with his boot, sending it sliding across the floor. Frightened cheeps filled the air as the chicks scattered. Robert tried to push himself up, blood trickling from his split brow. Through wavering vision, he saw a heavy boot come down, heard the soft crunch and sudden silence of one small life ended. "Stop this." A woman's voice rang out from the doorway. Emma Fitch stood there, a milk jug forgotten in her hands, horror written across her face. "I'm getting the sheriff." Her skirt swished as she turned and ran. The ranch hands hesitated, looking to Decker. The foreman's lip curled. "We're not done," he snarled. "Tell your red friends to clear out or we'll finish this at their camp." He jerked his head at his men, and they filed out, boots thundering down the steps. Robert pressed a cloth to his bleeding brow, his hands shaking as he crawled to the overturned brooder box. 2 chicks huddled in the corner, trembling. A third lay still, its tiny body crushed. Daniel appeared at his side, tears streaming down his young face. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered, gathering the living chicks gently. "I'm so sorry." Taya moved quietly through the chaos, righting furniture and gathering scattered belongings. Her face was calm, but her movements held the tension of a drawn bow. The sound of hoofbeats approached at a gallop. Sheriff Leland burst through the door, his badge catching the weak morning light. He took in the scene with practiced eyes. The blood on Robert's face, the overturned furniture, the broken brooder box. "Emma told me what happened," he said grimly. "Did you recognize the men?" "Decker and his hands from Circle Bar," Robert said, wincing as he stood. "They threatened to attack the camp." The sheriff's face hardened. "I heard talk in town about some planning to torch Indian camps. Didn't think they'd move this bold." He pulled out a small notebook. "I'll need statements from all of you." As the sheriff took their accounts, Emma returned with clean cloths and witch hazel. She helped Robert clean his wound, while Taya spoke softly to Daniel in their language, calming his tears. "This isn't right," Emma said, her gentle hands belying the steel in her voice. "They can't just assault people in their own homes." "They think they can," the sheriff replied, closing his notebook. "But they've crossed a line. Assault, destruction of property, threats of arson. That's more than I can ignore." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll start my investigation, but you folks should warn the others at the camp. These men might not wait for the law to catch up." Robert nodded, though the movement sent pain shooting through his head. "We'll go now." He looked at Emma. "Would you come with us? They might need medical help if—" "Of course," she said firmly. "Let me gather supplies first." Robert packed cold compresses while Emma ran home for her medicine bag. His hands weren't quite steady as he checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. Violence wasn't his way, but he wouldn't let anyone harm those under his protection. The morning had brightened to full dawn when they stepped outside. Taya carried Daniel, while Robert led the way with Emma at his side. His head throbbed with each step, but his purpose was clear. They had to reach the camp before Decker's men, had to warn them of what was coming. Behind them, the cabin stood silent except for the soft peeping of 2 surviving chicks. The third lay wrapped in clean cloth, waiting for proper burial. Robert's heart ached at the small loss, but it steeled his resolve. No more innocent lives would be lost if he could help it. They moved quickly through the morning light, following the trail toward the ravine where Taya's people camped. Time pressed against them like a physical weight. Every shadow in the trees might hide watching eyes. Every snapping twig could signal approaching danger. Emma walked steadily beside him, her medicine bag clutched tight, determination written in every line of her face. She had chosen her side in this fight. Consequences be damned. Robert felt a surge of gratitude for her quiet strength. Ahead lay the ravine and whatever violence Decker and his men might bring. But they would face it together, settler and native, teacher and mountain man, united in defense of something larger than themselves. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across their path as they hurried toward whatever waited at the camp. Robert and Emma reached the ravine before noon, their lungs burning from the quick pace. Sweat dampened their clothes despite the cool spring air. The camp lay quiet in the shadowed hollow, smoke from breakfast fires already settled. "Ho, the camp," Robert called out, using the greeting Daniel had taught him. He kept his hands visible, rifle slung harmlessly across his back. Faces appeared between the trees, women first, then men, emerging cautiously from their lean-tos. Taya's aunt recognized them and hurried forward, speaking rapidly in Ute. Though Robert couldn't understand the words, her gestures and tone made the urgency clear. "We must move quickly," Taya translated, her voice tight with worry. "Decker and his men, they're coming?" Robert nodded grimly. "They threatened to attack the camp. We need to get everyone into the higher timber, where the horses can't follow easily." Emma stepped forward, her medicine bag clutched close. "We'll help you pack, there's no time to waste." The camp erupted into careful activity. Women rolled blankets and gathered cooking pots while men quickly dismantled the temporary shelters. Children clutched precious items, a carved toy, a string of beads, a treasured book. They worked in near silence, experience having taught them the value of quiet flight. Robert helped an elder secure his bundle, then turned to Taya. "Take them up the game trail past the spring. Stay quiet, stay hidden. I'm riding for the sheriff. We'll need witnesses and the law on our side." "The law has not always been our friend," Taya said softly. "Sheriff Leland's different," Emma assured her. "He's a good man, he'll help." A child's cry of alarm cut through the hushed activity. Heads turned toward the lower camp, where thin tendrils of smoke were beginning to rise above the trees. The acrid scent of burning pine reached them on the breeze. "They're already here," Robert growled. "They're burning the abandoned shelters." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Emma's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "Get these people to safety. I'll stay with them. Help tend any who struggle with the climb." Robert squeezed her shoulder in gratitude, then turned to the gathered band. "Go now. Follow Taya. Emma will help." He caught Daniel's scared eyes. "Be brave, son. Do what your mother says." The boy nodded, clutching Taya's skirts. The group began moving up the steep trail, disappearing like shadows into the deeper forest. Robert waited until the last were out of sight, then started down toward where Sadie was tethered. The crack of a rifle shot froze him in place. "Hold it right there!" Sheriff Leland's voice rang out from the lower trail. "Drop those torches." Robert crouched and moved carefully through the brush. Below, he could see two of Decker's men standing near a burning lean-to. The sheriff had them in his sights, his deputy moving to flank them. "This ain't your business, Sheriff," one man called back. "We're just clearing out trespassers." "Arson's my business," Leland replied evenly. "And assault. Got witnesses to what you did at Carter's place this morning." The men exchanged glances. The taller one dropped his torch and raised his hands. The other tensed, looking ready to bolt. "Don't try it, Jenkins," the sheriff warned. Jenkins tried it. He turned and sprinted for the trees. The deputy's shot kicked up dirt at his feet, but the man kept running. The other ranch hand made no move to follow, keeping his hands where Leland could see them. "Deputy, get those fires out," Leland ordered. "Mr. Thompson here and I are going to have a talk about this morning's events." Steel cuffs glinted as he approached the remaining arsonist. Robert backed away silently. The sheriff had things well in hand here. His duty lay elsewhere, making sure his cabin was secure before Taya and Daniel returned. The ride home seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than an hour. His head throbbed where Decker had struck him, each hoofbeat sending spikes of pain through his skull. The afternoon sun was already westering when he finally dismounted at his cabin. Emma arrived shortly after, her skirts dusty from the trail. She carried her medicine bag and a determined expression. "Let me see to that wound properly," she said, steering him to a chair. "It needs cleaning before it festers." Robert submitted to her ministrations, wincing as she dabbed witch hazel on the split skin. "The others?" "Safe," she assured him. "Well hidden in a box canyon Taya knows. They'll wait until dark, then circle wide to avoid being followed." Her gentle fingers probed the swelling around his eye. "This is going to bruise spectacularly." "Reckon I've had worse." He tried to smile, but it pulled painfully at his injured face. Emma clucked her tongue and applied more witch hazel. They sat in comfortable silence as she worked, broken only by the soft peeping of the two surviving chicks in their restored brooder box. The sun had set and true dark was settling when bootsteps sounded on the porch. Robert had the Spencer in his hands before the quiet knock came. "It's us," Taya's voice called softly. He opened the door quickly, ushering them inside. Daniel looked exhausted, swaying on his feet. Taya's face showed the strain of their circuitous journey, but her eyes were alert, scanning the cabin's interior. "Any trouble?" Robert asked, securing the door behind them. "None. We stayed in the deep woods, away from the trails." Taya helped Daniel shed his coat. "But we cannot keep running forever." "You won't have to." Robert said firmly. "You'll stay here tonight. I've got spare blankets for pallets by the hearth." Emma had already begun arranging bedding, creating comfortable nests near the warmth of the stove. "I'll stay too," she said. "More eyes watching is better, and it wouldn't be proper otherwise." Robert nodded gratefully. He trusted Emma's judgment in such matters. "I'll take first watch from the chair here. Got a clear view of both doors and the main window." The Spencer rested across his knees as he settled into the straight-backed chair. Its familiar weight was both comfort and burden. He prayed he wouldn't need to use it, but he would if forced. Daniel curled up in his blankets, already half asleep. Taya sang softly to him, an old song that seemed to speak of safety and peace. Emma arranged herself modestly on another pallet, her presence lending respectability to their unusual household. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning around the cabin's eaves like a lost soul. The sound carried memories of other nights when violence had stalked the darkness, when good people had faced hard choices. Robert found himself whispering, words spilling out soft and broken in the lamplight. "Lord, if you're listening, protect these innocents. Give me courage to do what's right. Help me keep them safe." He paused, throat tight. "Please." The wind's cry faded to a whisper. Inside the cabin, breathing slowed as his guests drifted toward sleep. Robert stayed alert in his chair, watching the darkness beyond the windows. The Spencer lay ready across his lap, but his true strength came from something deeper, the certainty that he was, at last, doing what needed to be done, whatever the cost might be. The night deepened toward midnight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that went unanswered. Robert shifted in his chair, adjusting his grip on the rifle, and settled in for the long hours until dawn. The morning sun painted long shadows across Robert's cabin yard as he saddled Sadie. His split brow ached, but determination pushed the pain aside. They needed allies, and today would tell if the town's conscience could be stirred. Emma arrived just as he finished checking the cinch, her hair neatly pinned beneath her Sunday bonnet despite the early hour. She carried a small Bible and wore her best blue calico dress, proper attire for calling on Brother Rollins. "Taya and Daniel are settled with breakfast," she reported. "I left them plenty of cornbread and the primer book to study." Robert nodded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. "Much obliged for coming with me. Reckon the preacher will take this better if you're there." "A woman's presence can smooth rough paths," Emma agreed. She accepted his help mounting her own horse, borrowed from the livery. And Brother Rollins respects education, if not always those who need it most. They rode at an easy pace toward town, the morning cool and clear around them. Robert rehearsed his arguments in his mind, searching for words that might reach past prejudice to the preacher's better nature. The church stood quiet at the edge of Mineral Ridge, its white-painted boards gleaming in the early light. Brother Rollins's small house nestled behind it, smoke already rising from the chimney. Robert helped Emma dismount, then squared his shoulders and knocked at the door. The preacher answered quickly, already dressed in his dark suit despite the hour. His eyes widened at Robert's bruised face, then narrowed as he recognized his visitors. "Brother Carter, Miss Fitch." He stepped back, gesturing them inside with careful courtesy. "What brings you calling so early?" Robert removed his hat, waiting until they were seated in Rollins's sparse parlor before speaking. "Need to talk about what happened yesterday, brother. About justice and Christian charity." "I heard rumors," Rollins said stiffly, "about trouble at your place and fires." "More than rumors." Robert's voice stayed level as he described the morning assault, the crushed chick, the arson at the camp. Emma's hands twisted in her lap as he spoke, but her chin remained high. Rollins's face hardened. "While I cannot condone violence, surely you see that harboring these people only encourages—" "They have names," Emma interrupted quietly. "Daniel, Taya, a mother and child seeking help when illness struck." She withdrew Hartley's note from her Bible. "They travel with official permission, Brother Rollins. See here, authorized for rations, signed by the Indian agent himself." The preacher accepted the paper, scanning it with a frown. Robert seized the moment to press his case. "Scripture tells us to welcome the stranger, brother. To care for widows and orphans. These are God's children too, seeking nothing but survival with dignity." "I was hungry and you gave me food," Emma added softly. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Rollins's shoulders slumped slightly as the familiar verses found their mark. He studied Robert's battered face, then Emma's earnest expression. You truly believe this is the Lord's work? He asked finally. I do, Robert answered, with all my heart. The preacher was silent for a long moment, fingers drumming on his Bible. The congregation fears what they don't know, he said at last. Fear breeds ugly actions. Then let them meet those they fear, Emma suggested. Let them see faces instead of shadows. Rollins straightened, decision crystallizing in his expression. Bring them to the church Cottonwood this afternoon. I'll have the congregation gather after services. He held up a hand as Robert began to protest. I'll provide written safe passage and I'll bring food openly, but my people need to see who they're judging. Robert exchanged glances with Emma, who nodded slightly. Agreed, he said. Though we'll need to move slow. Taya's still recovering her strength. The Lord's time is perfect time, Rollins replied, already reaching for paper to write the pass. I'll announce it at services. They left the preacher's house as the church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to morning worship. Robert helped Emma mount, relief lightening his steps. That went better than I hoped, he admitted as they rode toward the sheriff's office. The Spirit moves in its own way, Emma smiled. Sometimes we need only open the door. Sheriff Leland was already at his desk when they arrived, coffee cup in hand. He listened gravely as Robert swore out his complaint, recording each detail with careful precision. Got Thompson's confession about the arson, he reported when Robert finished, and 3 witnesses saw Decker throw the first punch at your place. He set down his pen. I'll have warrants for him and Jenkins by noon. No man's above the law in my town. Much obliged, Sheriff, Robert said quietly. Reckon having the law's support means a lot right now. Leland's weathered face creased in a slight smile. Way I see it, you're doing right by folks in need. That deserves backing. He glanced at the complaint form. I'll serve these papers myself. Meanwhile, keep alert. Some men don't take kindly to the law proving them wrong. The sun had passed its peak when Robert and Emma returned to the cabin. They found Daniel practicing his letters while Taya sorted herbs near the window, her hands moving with quiet purpose. Robert explained the afternoon's plan carefully, watching their faces. Daniel's eyes lit with interest at mention of meeting other children, but Taya's expression remained guarded. You're sure it's safe? She asked, studying Rollins's written pass. The sheriff knows we're coming. Emma and I will be with you, and Brother Rollins gave his word. That means something in this town. Taya nodded slowly. Then we will go. Perhaps it is time to meet fear with faces, as you say. They set out after the heat of the day began to fade, moving at a pace Taya could manage. Robert led Sadie, who carried their few supplies, while Emma walked beside Daniel, quietly reviewing his primer words. The great cottonwood came into view just as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. A small crowd already waited beneath its spreading branches, mostly women and children from the morning service, with a few men standing apart. Brother Rollins stepped forward as they approached, his black coat stark against the tree's pale bark. Welcome, he said clearly, pitching his voice to Carrie. We're glad you've come. Robert helped Taya settle on a fallen log while Emma drew Daniel forward to meet her students. The boy's shy smile seemed to ease some of the tension in watching faces. This is Daniel, Emma announced. He's learning his letters just like you all did. And this is his mother, Taya, who knows healing herbs and beautiful songs. A few of the children edged closer, curiosity overcoming caution. One small girl offered Daniel a piece of rock candy, which he accepted with careful courtesy. Thank you, he said in clear English, just as Emma had taught him. The girl's mother pressed her hands to her heart, surprise softening her features. Other women began to step forward, bringing bread and preserved fruit. Taya accepted each gift with quiet dignity, speaking her own thanks in both languages. Robert stood back, watching as fear began to melt into cautious welcome. Not everyone approached. Some men still held themselves apart, faces hard. But it was a beginning. Brother Rollins raised his voice as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Tonight we'll hold a prayer meeting, he announced, for justice with mercy, as our Lord commands. All are welcome to join in asking his guidance. Robert touched Taya's shoulder gently. Time to head back, he murmured. Best to be home before dark. They made their farewells, Emma promising to bring more books tomorrow. The return journey was slow but peaceful, with Daniel clutching his candy and Taya carrying a basket of gifts. The cabin waited ahead, its windows warm with lamplight. Robert helped them inside, knowing that while one afternoon couldn't erase years of prejudice, something had shifted. They were no longer alone in standing for what was right. Justice with mercy, the preacher had said. Perhaps that was what they'd begun to build today, one careful step at a time. The church bell tolled 12 times as townsfolk gathered for the noon prayer meeting. Summer heat shimmered off the packed dirt of the churchyard, where Brother Rollins had arranged benches in a circle beneath the cottonwood shade. Robert helped Taya settle on a wooden bench while Daniel sat cross-legged on a blanket with Emma's students. A few ranchers stood apart, arms crossed and faces dark. Tom McKinnon spat in the dust. "Ain't right," he muttered, "giving away what's ours." But others moved forward, women carrying covered dishes and men with sacks of flour or beans. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, set a still warm loaf near Taya with a hesitant smile. Brother Rollins raised his hands for quiet. "Let us begin with the word," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. He opened his Bible, sunlight catching the gilt edges. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." The congregation settled, though tension hummed beneath the surface like distant thunder. Robert kept one eye on the grumbling ranchers while Rollins spoke of gentleness, of Christ's teachings about loving neighbors. Emma stood next, smoothing her skirts. "I'd like to share what my students wrote about kindness," she said. She unfolded several papers covered in careful childhood script. Mary Beth writes, "Daniel showed me how to make a whistle from a willow branch. He says thank you just like Mama taught me to." A ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Mary Beth's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And Tommy says the new boy knows bird calls. He's teaching me their names in his language, and I'm teaching him their names in English." Emma's voice grew stronger. "These children see with clear eyes without the shadows of old fears." Sheriff Leland chose that moment to step forward, a paper in his hand. "Speaking of fears," he said, "let's address them proper." He moved to the church door, hammer in hand, and nailed up a wanted notice. "Jenkins is still at large for the arson, $5 reward for information leading to arrest. Law's the same for everyone. No man has right to destroy another's shelter." Robert cleared his throat. "While we're speaking of rights," he said, "there's a practical matter needs settling." He stood, feeling all eyes turned to him. "The spring near my cabin. It's been contested ground. I hold the water filing, but that water sustained folks here long before papers existed." Murmurs rose. McKinnon stepped forward. "You aiming to give away water rights to—" "I'm proposing we share what God provided," Robert cut in firmly. "A written agreement, proper and legal. My filing amended to honor customary use during recovery times. No one loses. We all gain peace." Emma was already pulling paper and pencil from her satchel. "I can draft the language," she offered. "Simple terms we all understand." Brother Rollins nodded. "I'll witness it. And I'll notarize under county authority," Leland added. "Make it fully binding." They gathered at a rough table while Emma wrote in her clear hand. Robert watched Taya's face as the words took shape, sharing rights, reasonable use, mutual respect for the source that sustained all life. A cloud of dust on the road announced a rider approaching. Mr. Hartley from the agency dismounted, mopping his brow. "Got your telegraph this morning," he said to Robert. "Came to approve the pass arrangement myself. Limited town access, mind you, market days and church meetings only." "That's all we ask," Taya said quietly. "A chance to trade fair and worship in peace." The afternoon stretched long as neighbors lingered, first reading and signing the water agreement, then gradually turning to practical tasks. Robert organized crews to haul buckets to douse still smoldering embers from the campfire. Others helped mend the scorched fence line, passing tools and water as the sun beat down. The work drew them together despite themselves. Even McKinnon eventually joined in, grudgingly accepting a dipper of water from Daniel with a muttered thanks. As evening approached, people gathered on Robert's porch sipping coffee and speaking in low voices. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had eased like a too-tight rope finally slackened. Emma sat with her primer open, watching Daniel trace letters with careful concentration. "Very good," she encouraged. "You'll be reading stories soon." Taya leaned close to Emma, speaking softly. In my language, we say piagai for peace. She shaped the word carefully. It means more than just quiet. It means hearts resting easy, like earth after rain. Piagai, Emma repeated, the strange syllables feeling right somehow. She watched Daniel form each letter, one by one, while coffee cups clinked and voices murmured on the porch. Robert stood at the railing, seeing how the last sunlight caught the newly repaired fence, the spring flowing clear and steady beyond. Not perfect peace, perhaps, but a beginning. Hearts learning to rest easy, like earth after healing rain. The papers lay signed on his table inside. Water rights, passage permits, and promises of neighbors to help neighbors. Small things, maybe, but like Daniel's careful letters, each mark moved them forward toward something better than fear. 2 mornings after the water-sharing agreement, Robert sat at his rough-hewn table, carefully fitting new slats into the damaged brooder box. The surviving chicks huddled near the stove, peeping softly. Through his open door, morning light spilled across a collection of gifts from neighbors, scraps of wood, spare nails, even a length of wire mesh that Sarah Miller's husband had delivered yesterday with a gruff nod. Daniel watched Robert's hands work the wood, his dark eyes intent. "Mr. Robert," he said hesitantly, Could we go see our old camp?" Robert set down his hammer, studying the boy's face. "Looking for something special?" "My whistle," Daniel said. "The bone one my grandfather carved. And maybe—" He trailed off, shoulders hunching. Robert nodded slowly. "We'll do it proper. Let me send word to the sheriff first so he knows we're going." He scribbled a brief note and had Emma deliver it on her way to school. The morning sun climbed higher as they saddled Sadie. Robert lifted Daniel up, then swung into the saddle behind him. They rode at a careful walk, the horse's hooves making soft thuds in the pine duff. The burned camp lay quiet under scattered clouds. Blackened poles thrust up like accusing fingers, and ash swirled in little eddies around the horse's feet. Robert helped Daniel down, keeping a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Watch your step in the charcoal." Daniel moved carefully through the ruins, scanning the ground. Near what had been the cooking area, he stopped. "Here!" He bent down, brushing ash away with gentle fingers. The bone whistle emerged, its surface smoky but unbroken. As Daniel cleaned his treasure, Robert noticed something half hidden under a fire-blackened crate. "Hold on, son. What's this?" Together they lifted the crate. Beneath it, wrapped in singed cloth, lay 3 eggs. Robert's breath caught as he carefully unwrapped them. The shells were warm but uncracked, somehow protected by their hiding place. Daniel's eyes went wide. "Like your eggs," he whispered, "a gift from Creator." Robert had to swallow hard before he could speak. "That's exactly what they are." He pulled out his handkerchief and showed Daniel how to nestle the eggs safely. "We'll carry them home gentle as can be." The ride back took twice as long, Robert keeping Sadie to her smoothest walk while Daniel cradled the precious bundle. Every few minutes the boy would peek under the cloth, checking his cargo. At the cabin, Taya sat in Robert's old rocker by the stove, her strength returning more each day. She looked up as they entered, her eyes brightening at their careful movements. Robert took his time preparing the warmed stone box, explaining each step to Daniel. "See here. Wool first, then the warm stones wrapped just so. Test the heat with your palm, like this." Daniel nodded seriously. "Turn them every 2 hours, check the stone's warmth. Keep the lamp near, but not too near." Taya began to hum softly, a blessing song that filled the cabin's corners with hope. Robert recognized the melody from the day the first chicks hatched. The last rays of sun faded as Robert finally placed the eggs in their new nest. Lamplight threw long shadows on the wall as he whispered, "We'll do this right." Daniel stood on tiptoe to set his bone whistle on the hearth mantel, right next to Robert's Bible. The carved instrument seemed to catch the light like a promise, marking this place as home. Gray shadows filled Robert's cabin before dawn, broken only by the steady glow of the lamp near the brooder box. For 2 full days, he and Daniel had maintained their vigil, trading shifts through day and night. They ventured out only for necessities, hauling water from the creek, splitting enough wood to keep the cabin warm. The careful routine of turning eggs and checking stones had become a kind of prayer. Robert stirred from his chair at the first tap-tap sound. "Daniel," he whispered, touching the boy's shoulder where he dozed on his pallet. "Listen." They knelt by the box watching the shell move. Tiny cracks appeared, spreading like lightning across the surface. Taya joined them, wrapping her shawl close as she settled on a low stool. A knock at the door startled them. Emma Fitch stood on the porch holding a covered basket that steamed in the cool air. Behind her, Brother Rollins and Sheriff Leland removed their hats. Two ranch wives, Mary Thompson and Sarah Miller, carried additional dishes. "We thought you might welcome company," Emma said softly, setting out fresh biscuits and coffee. They gathered around the brooder box, speaking in hushed tones as the first chick worked its way free. Its damp feathers slowly dried in the lamp's warmth, and weak cheeps filled the cabin. Sheriff Leland cleared his throat. "Caught Decker last night," he said, accepting a tin cup of coffee. "Found him holed up in Old Man Weber's line shack. He'll cool his heels in jail until the circuit judge comes through." Thunder rumbled outside and rain began to patter against the roof. The spring storm built quickly, wind rattling the window frames. "Best secure things," Robert said, rising. The neighbors moved efficiently, men checking shutters while the women gathered eggs and milk inside. Sarah Miller helped Taya bring in extra firewood before the rain could soak it. As the storm raged outside, they sat close around the hearth. Taya's voice rose and fell, telling an old story passed down through generations. She spoke of two warrior bands who laid down their weapons after a wise woman showed them how sharing water helped all their children thrive. "That would make a powerful lesson," Brother Rollins said thoughtfully. "Would you consider sharing it with the congregation on Sunday?" Taya nodded, her eyes warm. "Stories help hearts understand each other," she said in careful English. Near afternoon, the second egg began to crack. They watched together as another chick pushed into the world, all legs and determination. The storm gradually spent itself, leaving behind fresh-washed air and the scent of wet pine. As the neighbors prepared to leave, Emma squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "You'll read for us in class tomorrow?" she asked, and he nodded eagerly, already reaching for his primer. The cabin grew quiet again. Robert sat in his old chair while Daniel practiced reading, sounding out each word with Taya's gentle encouragement. The familiar page had become a bridge between them all. "See how the bird flies? Home. To nest. Safe. Within. God's care." Robert's eyes grew heavy as peace settled over the cabin like a warm blanket. The newest chick, barely dry, nestled into his curved palm, its tiny heart beating against his calloused skin. His last thought before drifting off was simple gratitude, for new life, for justice served quietly, for stories that helped heal old wounds, and for the family he'd found when he least expected it. The Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, 1 week after the first magpie chicks had broken shell. Robert adjusted his freshly pressed shirt collar, watching Daniel help Taya wrap her best shawl. The past 7 days had settled into steady rhythms, feeding the growing chicks, finalizing water rights at the county office, and hearing news that Decker would face the circuit judge for his crimes. They walked together toward the giant cottonwood where Brother Rollins held his outdoor services. Townsfolk gathered on rough-hewn benches, nodding as Robert's small family approached. Emma Fitch waved them toward seats she had saved near the front. After the opening hymn, Rollins invited Taya to speak. She rose gracefully, her dark eyes scanning the congregation before beginning in careful English. "My people know stories of mercy," she said softly. "When strangers share water and break bread together, the Great Spirit smiles. Thank you for choosing peace over fear. May we walk forward as neighbors, not enemies." Daniel translated additional words she spoke in Ute, about teaching children to value kindness above pride. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Emma stood next, smoothing her skirts. "I am pleased to announce Daniel will join our school lessons starting tomorrow," she said brightly. "Additionally, I am forming a reading circle open to all who wish to learn. We will meet Tuesday evenings in the church." Sheriff Leland took his turn, hat in hand. "The law must stand stronger than vengeance," he stated firmly. "Mr. Decker will face proper justice for assault and arson. This community thrives through order, not violence." That evening, Robert's cabin glowed with lamplight and laughter. Neighbors arrived carrying covered dishes, Martha Thompson's rabbit stew, Sarah Miller's golden cornbread, preserved peaches from the mercantile owner's wife. Young Ted Wilson brought his fiddle, filling the air with lively tunes while children danced. Above the merriment came a familiar sound, the tap-tap-tap of a determined beak. Everyone gathered around as the third rescued egg began to crack. Daniel held his bone whistle ready, waiting to welcome the new arrival with a soft melody. As the chick emerged into their circle of warmth, Robert felt tears spill down his cheeks. He bowed his head, voice rough with emotion. Lord, I thank you for this house, not built on blood, but on love. For neighbors who choose mercy. For family found in unlikely places. When the music slowed and most guests had gone home, Robert sat with Taya and Daniel in the lamp's gentle glow. The new chick peeped softly from its nest while its older siblings dozed nearby. I want you both to stay, Robert said carefully. Not just until you're strong again, but as family. Daniel, I can teach you ranching work, proper skills. You'll attend school, learn reading and figures. He looked at Taya. This cabin has room enough we could add on come summer. Taya touched the water-sharing ledger that lay open on the table, its fresh signatures still drying. A good house, she said softly, grows from truth between hearts. Daniel's eyes shone as he lifted his whistle and played a quiet song of thanksgiving. The lamplight caught their faces, 3 people who had found belonging in each other's care. Outside, the spring wind whispered through pine needles, carrying promise of green days ahead. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.